All right, our first panelist is Zoe Flowers. I want to tell you a little bit of information about Zoe. Zoe is a screenwriter, playwright, Reiki master, and writer for the Huffington Post. Zoe spent many years working at several domestic violence coalitions and now works to center the healing and voices of survivors and advocates of color as the director of survivor programs at the Women of Color Network. She is also the author of From Ashes to Angel's Dust, A Journey Through Womanhood, a collection of interviews conducted with African American survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So without further ado, let's welcome Zoe to the panel.
Hey, Sheba.
All right, so my first question for you today is, how did you get into the work that you do? How did that all begin?
Yeah, so is my volume still okay?
Yeah, everything sounds
Yeah,
really
okay.
good.
Amazing. Yeah, I started like so many folks in the work. I started as a survivor. I came to the work as a survivor and had no idea that what I had actually gone through was domestic violence. I thought I was just in a relationship, where I was trying to help my partner deal with his anger. And then it took me actually going to work at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where they just had a huge library, and I just started reading all these things, and I just was like, wow, I'm actually a part of something huge that's been happening for a really long time. There's actually a name for what I went through. There's actually societal reasons why I wound up in the relationship I wound up in. I thought it was just an individual thing.
Sure.
And so I initially just joined the work kind of consciously and unconsciously in a way. I just kind of was looking for a job, and I saw a job as an office manager at the Georgia Coalition, and I just applied on some, again, consciously and unconsciously, I guess. I was just drawn to it, and then I just stayed in the work and just went on and on and on. So.
I want to ask you, so in addition to your work as the director of survivor programs at the Women of Color Network, in 2014, you also launched Soul Requirements, which combines your artistic projects, domestic violence expertise, as well as holistic healing practices. Can you share a little bit more of information about that?
About the sort of why I started the organization?
Yeah, and how you brought together all those interests to create this new platform.
Yeah, I kind of had to, right? Because early in my advocacy career, I just noticed some things. I just noticed that, it wasn't the healthiest environment, the movement. And for me personally, I just said, if I'm going to stay in this work, I have to do this work in a way that is actually healthy for me. Because when I entered the work, I was just idealistic and I didn't really know what it was. And so I just had to really just look for other things. And I was always drawn to the metaphysical world. I was always into crystals and meditation and all of those things. And journaling. And I just, before I entered back into the work, I was like, if I'm going to be in this work, I have to do it in this way. I have to bring these spiritual elements into this work, because if I don't, I'm not going to make it.
Sure. And so with the part of Soul Requirements, you brought some other artists, and you did a performance at the 2016 NCADV National Conference. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was about?
Yes, that was such an amazing experience. It was so great for my ensemble. So in around 2015, I started writing a book, which is From Ashes to Angels, Just a Journey Through Womanhood, where I interviewed survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Again, women and girls like me, because it just seemed like everywhere I turned, my friends were being abused, or they had grown up in abusive homes, or they had had experiences with molestation. It just seemed like every single person, right? Black women. And we never talked about it. And there were when I started researching, the only book around was Change, Change, Change by Evelyn White. And that was from the 70s. And so there just was not a lot of resources for me in about 19. Well, I was in my relationship in the mid 90s. And then when in the 2000s, when I started to really do research, there just wasn't a lot of information that I found. And so I thought, I'm just gonna interview my people then, and I'm gonna start interviewing other survivors. And I just went, I found other survivors and started documenting their stories. And as I was writing the book, I knew I wanted to turn it into a play or a documentary and do something. And so did the book, worked in the movement for 100 years, and then decided to create a play, or really a choreodrama from
Mhm.
the book, from the stories in the book. And that is Ashes. And so that uses poetry, vignettes, monologues, to tell the stories that are in the book. But also, because I had to take it from the page to the stage, I had to create a context, a framework to make it interesting to people on the stage. So I set it. So I started it with on a slave ship, because for me, as I think about domestic violence, I think of it in relation to domestic violence. I think of it as the ultimate form of domestic violence. When I look at the slave trade, I see the emotional abuse, the sexual abuse, the spiritual abuse. So for me, I see the slave trade within the context of that power and control wheel.
Mhm.
And so I wrote the play from that perspective. So the play starts on the slave ship and it brings you all the way up to today,
Yes.
with all of the things that women of color experience, whether it's body image, the media, obviously domestic and sexual violence, but most importantly, how do we love ourselves within the context of all those things? And so we use ritual, because again, those are things that help me heal.
Mhm.
Um, and so we perform, all over the country, and y'all were, wonderful enough to bring us out, and we had a great time where we got to perform, for y'all's national conference, which was amazing.
Awesome. Well, that brings me to my next question. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the book From Ashes to Angel's Dust: A Journey
Yeah.
Through Womanhood, because you talked about how it emerged through a series of interviews that you conducted with women of color who had experienced domestic and sexual violence. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like of conducting those interviews, and maybe some of the things that you might have learned in from hearing from those women of color?
Sure. Well, I learned so much because, first of all, I started writing the book when I was at the Georgia Coalition. So again, I was a new advocate. I was a baby in the movement.
Oh
And
wow.
again, so when I first started writing that book, I had a very sort of, well, I got out of it and you can do. And the book was just like horrible, it was so judgmental, because I didn't know, again, that there was this history of this movement, and that it's a societal issue, and there are reasons that people can't leave.
Yeah.
So so I just had this wealth of knowledge available to me when I started writing the book. And I was like, oh my God, I got to go back and I got to change everything. And then when I started talking to the women, because the book, there's women who were drug addicted and they got with their partners because they both like to get high, period. They like to get high, they like to sell drugs, and violence was a part of that relationship. So you had that. Then there was a woman who was an attorney who had never had violence in her life. She wound up in an abusive relationship. So one of the things that I really learned was that anybody is susceptible. It just doesn't matter. Anybody is susceptible. So that was one of the things that I learned. Um, the other thing that I learned was how strategic and smart women are in those relationships, the things they had to do to stay safe in the relationships, the way they got out of the relationships. Um, and so the process started really with, the book started as a book of fiction, first of all. Again, just this subconscious, conscious thing where I was like, I'm going to write a book so nobody has to go through what I went through. Went to the library, there were no books, and it was supposed to be a book of fiction, 5 girlfriends, where one girlfriend was in an abusive relationship. And the more I wrote, the girl who was in the abusive relationship started taking over the whole story. And that's when I was like, ooh, maybe there's something here. Like maybe I need to delve deeper and pay more attention to this. And so then Spirit just said to me, you need to tell the truth. You need to write the truth and you need to tell the truth. So I started interviewing my friends first. And then I started investigating shelters in Atlanta. And I started going to groups, and I would just talk to the women. I would just notice the women in the groups and see who was like the women that were the most talky. And then I would approach them afterwards and I would say, hey, I'm doing this project about women of color. Are you interested in telling your story? And I would go to their houses and interview them. I'd meet them in coffee shops. They came to my house. And then I went around and I put flyers up in coffee shops around Atlanta and sent emails out. People sent me their stories in the mail. I put flyers up in Black bookstores, and people just sent me their stories.
Mhm.
and I just wrote them.
Fantastic. I think that's a very powerful way to talk about this. I think to be able to do these interviews and publish it into a book, and that kind of leads me on to my next question, which also has to do with your your role as a contributing author for the Huffington Post. Can you talk to us a little bit about the type of pieces that you write for the Huffington Post and how you're using that as a platform to discuss issues that are relevant to Black women?
Yeah, so I became a contributor right after the selection, not the election, I call it the selection. And so one of my friends after was like, I think you need to write for the Huffington Post. So she sent some writing samples in. And so some of the first articles I wrote, because of course, right, we were so concerned about VAWA right away. And so one of the first articles I wrote was about the Trump effect on domestic violence victims. I also wrote about transgender women of color being murdered and how nobody was really, still doesn't really pay attention to what's happening. So I really, I just write stories about what's happening in the work. Sometimes I add poetry to it, but I mainly talk about domestic and sexual violence issues. And I also kind of mix it with spirituality as well, because one of the articles I wrote was about resistance, because I don't think that word and that stance is a good way to move things forward. And so I talk about resistance and what resistance actually does to the central nervous system. I talk about resistance from a metaphysical perspective and just give some alternatives to this whole thing about resist, because from an energetic, those of us who believe in sort of metaphysical practices, et cetera, we know what you resist persists.
Uh-huh.
And so, and the more you talk about something, the more you give energy to it. And so that's what that article is about. So I infuse some spiritual stuff in there, and some metaphysical stuff as well. So,
Great.
yeah.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your role at the Women of Color Network. So I wanted to ask you, how does your organization define the term women of color? And talk to us a little bit about how you might have come up with that sort of framework for the work you do.
Yeah, so as this, definition says, that it's a political term, women of color. And so we really wanted to make sure that this definition was as inclusive as possible, because a lot of times, especially back in like the early 2000s, there was this thing where people just automatically think women of color meant Black. And so a lot of other groups didn't always want to join. I'm not just talking about the Women of Color Network. I'm talking about even when I was at coalitions and there were caucuses and people didn't want to join the caucuses because they were called the Women of Color Caucus. And people thought that meant AKA Black Woman Caucus. We are not Black. We don't want to be a part of that. So there's always this tension around that. So what I love about WOCN is that they created sort of this broad term, right? So if you have a shared history of economic disenfranchisement, if you have a shared history of the loss of autonomy, displacement, militarism, right? Race, class, gender-based oppression, intersections, etc. That falls under the blanket of women of color. If you identify as a woman of color on a daily basis, then then you would fit into this category of women of color. So it's really about shared ethnicity and race.
Absolutely. Okay, and then I wanted to ask a little bit about about some of the programmatic work that you all are doing at the Women of Color Network to support Black women.
So we have a couple of grants, and so we work intersectionally, right? And so right now we have an ABC project, which works to really build the leadership of African American, Afro-Caribbean women. We do that through a series of trainings and webinars and things of that nature. We also work with STOP administrators to help them better reach and resource underserved communities, to help them write RFPs that ultimately will help them fund more culturally specific programs. We do a lot of work nationally to talk about how the one size fits all cookie cutter models that a lot of programs administer are not always best for communities of color. So we do a lot of work around also. We have an economic policy and leadership process, a program where, again, we work to ensure the safety and security of survivors of color. And then we just got finished with a project, a CSAJ project, where we did a series of listening sessions with women of color who were also survivors. We did that across the country to really gauge what the needs are, and that report will be coming out soon.
That's awesome. I appreciate that, because I think it gives people on the webinar some ideas of work that's currently being done, and maybe they can use some of the ideas that could be relevant for their community, or be inspired by some of the work that you all are doing, because I do think it's very powerful. So how about this? Let's go into our live Q&A with the webinar audience. So feel free to use your questions box to go ahead and chat some questions in for Zoe, and we will see if we can address some of those on today's webinar.
Sounds good.
First, I'll start out with a question, which is, can you think of a defining moment while you were doing the work that you do, where you felt victorious, where you felt like you were doing the work you want to be doing in this world?
Yeah. Okay. How do I do that without getting in trouble? Okay. So I'll do the safe route.
Okay.
So for me, one of the things that's so awesome about WOCN is, our CEO, Tanya Lovelace, really supports us bringing our whole selves to the work, right? So she knows that I do this wellness work. She knows that I'm out here doing that. And so I don't even know how it started, but it just started where I was just asked to do wellness exercises in the beginning of all of our trainings. And so now at any training, whether it's our economic policy training or our STOP project, where we have STOP administrators on their feet, honey, closing their eyes, meditating, doing wellness exercises. And so it was just that is really a defining moment where it was just like, wow, like this is really amazing that space has been made for wherever we are to bring this wellness in. So we do that again. We do it in the morning. We do it after lunch. Sometimes we do it at the end of the day. Not too much, but yeah. But so we're really incorporating wellness into our organization as individuals, and working with advocates. So that's exciting for me to see that shift.
All right, great. We have a couple of good questions. So, how do you prevent burnout, especially as a survivor turned advocate in this movement? While the passion for the work is there, so is the stress and the triggers.
Yes, it is. So I just think, and I was talking with my sister about this last night, I just think you have to do things to nurture yourself. I just feel like that's the only way, because for me, usually by the time I get to December, I'm done. I don't want to talk to nobody. I don't want to help nobody. I don't want to do anything.
Yes.
But in the years where I have done things just for me throughout the year, I'm doing whatever it is, my yoga, getting to sleep on time, taking whatever, my bath, whatever. If I'm doing that throughout the year, come December, I'm good. But if I'm not taking care of myself, I will get resentful because I'm not doing the things I need to do. And so for me, I have to be artistic. I have to do my art. So you have to find what makes you joyful.
Yes.
Because this work can be very isolating. You have to find people who are a reflection of who you are, so that when you forget who you are, people can come back and say, wait a minute, what are you saying? That's not the person I know. You need to check yourself here, because you need to get it together. So doing that is important. I think saying no is amazing. I started doing that so much last year, and doing it without feeling guilty, just being like, that's not going to work for me. Because just that yes thing, you'll get burnt out.
Absolutely. And I had another sort of question/comment. One of our attendees said she finds positive affirmations have helped her to heal. She asked, what tools do you use to heal as a survivor of domestic violence?
So affirmations were really great for me sort of in the beginning of my metaphysical walk. But the thing about affirmations is that if you have to really believe in what you're saying, because again, it's just something really interesting about the brain and the way the brain works. and that resistance that we have inside of us. So you have to do very specific things to begin to trick your brain. And so there's a lot of, yeah, I don't want to get too deep on that. But so I do a lot of things to trick my brain. I do a lot of self-hypnosis. I do a lot of, to stop those tapes from not even just the abuse, but just being kids growing up in this country, being a Black woman, being a dark-skinned Black. There's just a lot of negative messages that are just in there all the time. So I do a lot of things to train my brain. No, we're not in that stage anymore. It's a new day. It's a new time. You're a different person. So, so I do, again, hypnosis type things. I do a lot of essential oils. I burn a lot of essential oils. I make oils. I wear oils. Again, oils to calm down the central nervous system, like lavender, peppermint. I'm a Reiki master, so I do lots of Reiki on myself, not as much as I need to on other people. Gosh, what else do I do? I do a lot. I got like a million altars around my house. I do a lot. I do a lot. I do a lot.
That's wonderful.
I mean, we got to. Yeah, it has to be a priority because it's just crazy out here.
It's just absolutely crazy out here sometimes. I just want to, my last and final question, and thank you all so much for your insightful questions. Let's keep them going to all the panelists. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to see. I'm sure that there are folks in the audience that may want to collaborate with you in the future. What are some ways that we can do that, or how can we connect with you?
Sure, amazing. And before I answer that question, I also want to say something about electronics, because so we are all energy, right? We are all energy. And so it is all of this: computers, phones, TV in the bedroom, microwave, all of that stuff. You really need to start paying attention to what that's doing to your body. So when you're talking about burnout and things like that, that can be depletion from not getting the right supplements. So you also need to look into supplements, but you also need to turn them phones off, stop sleeping with them phones in your bed, get them televisions out of your bedroom, stop using that microwave so much. Those frequencies are not good for your body all the time. So how you can get in touch with me, I have a YouTube channel, which is I Am Zoe Flowers. So I do I post quite a bit. I do like general readings and things like that on the YouTube.
Okay.
You can find me on Instagram, I Am Zoe Flowers. You can find me on Facebook, I Am Zoe Flowers. You can find me on Twitter, Divine by Design. You can find me on LinkedIn, I Am Zoe Flowers. So just type in I'm Zoe Flowers and see what comes up.
Type in I'm Zoe Flowers, and I also just added handles out to the whole audience today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is amazing work, and I really appreciate you sharing some of the work, the many aspects of the work that you're doing to create support, empowerment, and healing for Black women who are survivors. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And visit WOCNinc.org as well, because we're doing great stuff there too. So you want to sign up for our newsletters, our website, and follow us on social media.
You guys have like a really good, I think one of the most comprehensive sort of like monthly updates that goes out about all the information that has to do with like many different cultures and organizations that have to do with women of color. So I recommend signing on to that, because you will learn about organizations that you probably hadn't heard of before. So
absolutely.
Yes.
And there'll be more to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.